Maddie and I talked about how we could sort of maybe wrap up where we've been for the last couple months, and she'll share in the future some ideas of going forward with Church Grow in the next couple months. But I'm trying to sort of wrap things up, and as I decided to wrap things up, I thought about our conversations for the last 8 weeks, and I realized there's a recurring question that keeps coming up. And in almost every Sunday, the question, what can I do? And so I thought, well, let's just look at that in terms of what we can do as persons of faith in the context of our pandemic crisis right now, as well as life in an ongoing way. What can we do? And I'm going to turn to Robert Greenleaf again, the author of Servant Leadership, that's had such an influence in my life. And I'm going to be unfair to Greenleaf because I went back to my notes after a seminar with Greenleaf. We had a wonderful snowstorm the last day. And those of us who flew in to Indianapolis for the event, we couldn't get out. And so we decided, we were all there, so we just visited, and lo and behold, Greenleaf walks in. And he said, hey, since you folks are here, I'm here too, so let's visit. And I took some notes as he talked through what he thought were the ingredients of servant leadership. And he would turn the question around a little bit. Instead of what can I do, he always talked about what can I be. Now, to introduce you to Greenleaf, I think might be helpful real quickly. Greenleaf was a layperson. He was in the Quaker faith community. He was a person that worked for a major leading corporation in the world, and in his retirement reflected on leadership and realized that leadership had nothing to do with the position. Leadership had to do with who a person was in their very being, and leadership was defined whether or not there was followership. And he realized there were a lot of people that held important positions, but no one paid any attention and no one followed. But others were followed, and time again, it's because they were experienced as real servants of the community or servants of others. He was also a person that was at the Kent State tragic uprising that ended up in the death of many Kent State students in a time of civil unrest like we're experiencing today. A street divided the establishment and the students, and he walked across the street, sat down on the pavement all night with the students, and listened. Didn't share, just listened. And so that person wrote a book, and it started a movement called Servant Leadership. And so he would take our question, what can I do, and change it to, who can I be? And so these are just 9 components of one's being that I took notes on in the conversation with him. And the first thing he said, be a thinker. He pointed out that the most radical murder in the American culture that was taking place was the murder of reason. He said, we've become an information age. People are interested in information rather than thinking. He said, people are parroting what other persons are saying rather than thinking for themselves. And he said, we are called to be thinkers, using our heads, taking what other persons say and the experiences we have to think about these things. Because he said, without reason, we are gullible. And servants should never be gullible. So servants, be a thinker. He said, be aware. Be aware of what is going on. Do not live your life in a cocoon. And my, oh my, in the last 2 weeks, how important this is. As protests are on the street, servants are called to be aware of what's going on. And the gift of people filming the tragedies of life enables us to be aware. And quite frankly, being aware is important, because to be aware is refusing to not care. Once we are aware, we care. And then he said, servants are called to be empathetic. I love the story of the Good Samaritan, okay? Because the bishop and the district superintendent were walking down the road, and that they had a schedule. They had important things to do, and my hunch, they were sympathetic, and they probably sent a sympathy card. But the Good Samaritan stopped, went into the ditch, and we know the story. He was empathetic, taking on the identity of the view from the ditch, which is radically different than walking by and noticing and sending a card of sympathy. Empathy is deeper than sympathy. And then he talked about the importance of being a listener. Again, in what we're experiencing in the pandemic, in the murder and the street protests that we've all seen, it is very easy to voice our opinions first, because we want to be heard. But the servant chooses to listen first, to be sure that we're honoring the person with whom we might disagree, but we respect them through the art of listening. Indeed, the protests in the street are a desperate movement to be heard, and servants are willing to listen. But also, servants are called to be healers. It's very easy to be so absorbed by life that we forget that if the world is going to be a better place, healing must take place. Greenleaf died before the movement of reconciliation occurred in South Africa as a consequence of trying to move away from apartheid and a separate state. There was an experience of reconciliation, and what it took was the act of forgiveness was a prerequisite to healing. Not that we're called to forget anything. Forgive and forget, that's impossible. How about remembering and forgive? That is the healing experience, to remember and forgive rather than trying the impossible task of forgive and forget. Also, a servant is committed to the growth of others. Greenleaf would smile and say, the greatest joy that a servant can have in life is to enable another person's today to be better than that person's yesterday. And that's the source of joy. And we must be committed to the growth of others. For only as we're committed to the growth of others is the common good enabled in our world. He also talked about being one of foresight. He said, we remember our past, our history is a part of us, our history is important. But a servant always sees beauty in tomorrow that might not be experienced today. Always realizing that the decisions we make today have consequences tomorrow. So a person who's one of foresight always considers the consequences of their decisions rather than making decisions only for the good of today. I talked a couple, 3 weeks ago about the being persuasive, that being in control is not an option for very many people. But being persuasive is always an opportunity for anyone in any rank of life. I'll never forget in the seminar with Greenleaf, I was also for a period of time reading extremity literature. The extremity literature was penned in the Holocaust prisons of Germany, and how persons who survived those incarcerated journeys to death in those prisons, how they realized that indeed, even in that context, no one could take away their right to be persuasive with other prisoners or with the guards. Persuasion was still an opportunity they had. Finally, Greenleaf would become most excited about talking about being a builder of community. We've got to work for the common good, for the good of all, rather than seeking to divide in order to conquer. It's really pretty simple to look at my own life or to look at the life of others and see whether our efforts or their efforts or my efforts are really to build community for the common good or to divide the community in order to conquer. So Greenleaf would respond to the church school class at Grace United Methodist Church by saying, in response to our question, what can I do? He'd say, let's talk about what you can be, Bruce. And he would share these components of servant leadership, which I believe are components for a rich and meaningful way to life and way to live. So, a couple questions. Which of these do you find most challenging in your own life? Another question, which of these have you never thought about as being important in your journey of faith? Or the question, which do you feel are most lacking in our culture, in our community, or in our own congregation called Grace United Methodist Church? Thank you for being a part of the journey.